Um, we're going to cover a lot of ground, so buckle up. We're going to cover a lot of concepts, but we believe it's going to cover a couple of things that have been mentioned in the past, in the last couple of hours and last night as well, which is we're talking about the global rules, local necessities to regulate, about an industry that Saskia was talking about is the engine of everything, and we're going to show a little bit of that. But this engine, as you also said, is very bad at regulating itself. And so what do we do about this? This is a global thing, an engine, it's a global thing, and still we have to do something with it. So I would like to start this, this paper with something that comes from the natural sciences. And it was published by a person called Garrett Hardin in Science. And basically he was saying, here you have a small story happening. You have a couple of herdsmen, people that herd cows, and they can all let their cows feed on grass, which is common to everybody. And so the logic of these people is to, well, you know, this would be great. If I can add more cows to this pasture, then I'm going to get more food for my cows. I will get bigger cows. I can generate more profits from it. So I will be continuing to add more cows to this pasture. Now the problem is that everybody, all the herdsmen are thinking like that. And so they add more and more cows until there's no room for the cows to feed on the grass. And what happens in the end is a tragedy. Because all the grass is eaten, the soil that allows this grass to grow is depleted of its resource. And so the grass can no longer grow. And so that's a problem for the herdsman. And so what you'll see in natural systems, in fisheries, in all kinds of natural resource systems is that this happens a lot. It's called the tragedies of the commons. And so the reason, says Garrett Hardin in Science, is because each person is going to accrue the benefits of adding one more cow. And so that's a very big benefit. But the costs of that are shared by everybody. So he has, or she, has an incentive to add that cow, despite knowing that in the end, it's going to deteriorate the very resource on which they depend. Hence the tragedy of the commons. It's unavoidable, hence the tragedy. So this is something that has been studied for a long time. And over time, a woman called Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008, has dedicated her life to understanding how people deal with these kinds of problems. And she found out that many people can deal with the commons. They collectively, as people, devise governance structures that can deal with it. And she said, when comparing many of these governance systems, she tried to find out what are the rules, what are the commonalities between all those structures. She said, I cannot find the perfect governance system, but I can tell you about the governance rules. And so she talked about 8 rules. And she split some up, and now you cannot read this, so I summarized them for you, which is, first, we need rules about who is a user, who can be using the grass. Second, what is the common pool resource? What is the grass or the fishing pond, etc.? And how much can somebody use it relative to what the person is adding back? So rules about what can be used, etc. Second rule is we need to monitor how much resource there is, how much every user is taking, and the monitors have to be monitored themselves. They have to be held accountable. Third, we need processes to facilitate a shared understanding of the rules, but also that enable them to change the rules. Why? Because remember the tragedy of the commons. There's a clear incentive to continue to overexploit. So people are ingenious, and natural beings. So they will try to avoid the rules, and so they have to be adjusted to accommodate changes. And finally, because of this human ingenuity, and things happening outside of the system, you need multiple institutions that can capture, whenever something is slipping through the loopholes, this deviation, or that can help to devise solutions together. So those are the 8 rules, 11 actually in 4. The statement that we want to make is, now, if you look at the financial industry, it has deteriorated the very resource on which it's depending. So if we have all these lessons from the tragedies of the commons about how to manage them, can we overlay this tragedy onto the financial banking industry and learn some from of the lessons that Elinor Ostrom and all the people that have worked on her stuff, and see whether it works for this situation as well. And even Elinor Ostrom says she worked mostly on collective action, so self-regulation, but she also says the elites that devise these collective actions can actually devise governance structures that also favor their own interests. So actually, it's about many different institutions that will establish this governance structure. So where it comes from is not that important. The rules are for the commons, not necessarily only coming from the collective action. So that's what drove our paper. So to make the analogy, cows to the financial system, let me walk you through a little bit. You have a resource stock, which is the soil. If you deplete the soil, it's all gone. So that's the essential thing. Out of the soil comes the grass. And in order for that grass to grow, you need manure that, when there's cows on them, is natural. So they take some, but they give some. The resource user itself is the cow, but it is managed by a herdsman, so they actually make sure that the cows are there. And what's essential for the system to be able to continue is a regenerative capacity. That's what needs to be managed. So if you take some grass, there needs to be some manure that enables the soil to regenerate the capacity to grow more grass. And so that also requires time. So I hope you're still following. We have a system where we have grass that's taken by the cows, they feed in the manure, some time is needed, and then the system is fine. If you have overgrazing, too many cows, if you have not enough time to let the grass to push back, you have an overexploitation of the resource stock. And basically what will happen is the soil will not be able to push back the grass and will actually lose its capability of doing that. So the tragedy of the commons is, I, as a herdsman, will have an incentive to add more cows because, I get profits from those cows or the milk or whatever, while the risks of overgrazing are shared. I hope this is clear because it's essential for the continuation of our understanding of the paper. Please, if we can have, okay. So this is, okay. So when we want to use the same analogy to the financial industry, this is a balance sheet of any company. On the right side, you have liabilities, which is the debt, where it's basically you and me that are putting money on the balance sheet of the bank, the deposits, right? The bank itself has equity. It's the shares it's owned by its owners. And with that money, it can basically give money to other people, the loans. Now, whether or not these assets will be paid back is something it's a risk. So when people have the feeling that this is not really clear, they think, wait, I'm going to take my deposits out of the bank. They fear. And that's a big problem for the financial system as a whole, and it's called a bank run. So what needs to be done, what we need here is creditor confidence. The banking system needs creditors that say, I believe this. The risk is covered. So the equity that is here is going to be able to cover any losses that a bank would potentially be able to incur. So this is the soil on which the entire banking system is feeding as a whole. That's our commonality. It's the first contribution we're hoping to make. It's not an easy one, but I think it's critical. So you can make this entire list similarly. I'm not going to go into detail, but I hope you get that this creditor confidence element is really something that all banks are feeding on. And what you need to add back as a bank is credible assets. Credible assets. And so in addition, if there's risk, you need to, at the other side, make sure that there's enough equity. So this is something that the entire banking system is trying to manage. Yeah. So I'm passing it on to Matthias, who's the one that's been working on this in his dissertation, and he will be able to explain the specifics of the industry.
Thank you very much. So now we'll get to the banking industry and to the global local problem. Well, first of all, you're all familiar with the Basil framework. It's an international framework to prevent globally banks from the tragedy of the commons. It contains rules about the capital that is required to maintain the equity over loss exposure at an agreeable level. And in essence, what is very important here is that when we look at the emergence of Basil, it's actually a desire by the US banking regulator to impose this rule, and the US banks saying, listen, if you do this, you have to do this globally, because otherwise the Japanese banks are going to outcompete us. Okay? So it's a local desire, but it can only be dealt with globally. Now, the problem is, of course, you have regulatory arbitrage. And all of you who don't know the term directly, it just means let's find a way to get around the rules. Okay? So once you have a global rule system, boom, the industry goes like, how are we going to go around it? Well, of course, regulation is always set in quite coarse terms, so you go about it by finding financial innovation that allows you to avoid regulation. Now, the interesting part here, so we do not generally say that it's really bad, because we share the view of Fleischer that regulation is not always welfare enhancing. So there can be regulation that is actually bad, especially when it's done globally and it has to be implemented locally. It can be really bad in one place. Yeah. Now, okay, so the local evaluation of regulatory arbitrage of global rules is essentially the topic of this empirical part of this paper. So we have two research questions. How do you evaluate and govern financial innovations that aim to circumvent regulation, in this case global regulation? And second, how do you act as a local regulator in the face of global rules? And don't worry, we will link that back to the commons. So if you're asking yourself, what is that? We'll get back to that. Now here's our case. I looked in my dissertation, and we looked together at the asset-backed commercial paper market, which is a part of the shadow banking sector. And shadow banking just means we do banking without banking regulation, okay, for simplicity. Now, here's just a graph for you to understand a little bit what's going on. So this is a special purpose entity that is doing the banking action. It buys assets from sellers, and it refinances them in the financial market. And so far, so good, no problem. The only issue is that this thing cannot exist without the bank. All the profits of that thing are going to the bank, and that thing is doing everything the bank tells it to do. It is a robot. It's a robot company. It's a letter company, whatever you want to call it, letterbox company. Now, how does that relate to global regulation? Well, the interesting part is here, the bank provides a liquidity line to the SPE, basically ensuring that whenever there is a problem in the market, the bank will jump in. And this liquidity line is outside of global banking regulation. It's the first blind spot. The first blind spot of Basel regulation was a liquidity line of less than 1 year. No equity requirements. Okay? Number two, this special purpose entity, while it's actually just a continuation of the bank, is outside of the bank's balance sheet. That means all of the assets here will not be accounted for in this formula. So on the one hand, we have the first blind spot, which is the liquidity line. There is zero equity demanded for the risk that the bank takes here. And second, all these assets are not accounted for as assets on the balance sheet of the bank. Now, what we've done is we've asked ourselves, okay, so this is kind of like a global regulatory arbitrage technique, but it was dealt with very differently in different countries. And we've identified 3 countries where essentially what we get is we have 2 countries, the Netherlands and Germany, that are very active in this market. And then we have France that starts to be very active in this market, especially so, and then it drops before the crisis. And we really asked ourselves, how come? So we looked at that and we figure out, well, we can really find regulatory action in 1999, in 2001, and in 2002 in France that really brings about this limitation of regulatory arbitrage in France, whereas in the Netherlands, there's not really any action taken, neither in Germany. So we asked ourselves, how come? How come the French guys figured it out, detected the regulatory arbitrage, and limited it? So this graph is really just showing the most lethal part of regulatory arbitrage, and how come the others didn't capture it? So to do that, we collected 63 interviews with central banks, financial supervisor, the auditing association, banking association, senior bank managers, accounting standard setters, and so on, always asking, please explain us how this market was regulated. Who was driving it? Why was it happening? So, very quickly, here's the comparison, and here we get back to the comments. How do governments try to capture this regulatory arbitrage? Well, in the case of France, we find that the auditors and the bankers have to justify their accounting decisions for these robot companies. Yeah? Why are they off balance sheet? They have to justify it in front of the banking regulator. Okay? And the auditors have to inform the regulator when there's any doubt, when there's anything fishy happening. In the law it's written, you have to call us. You have to give us the information, what's going on. And in Germany and the Netherlands, we find that the auditors and the bankers are left to themselves, and they're never asked to explain their decisions in front of the banking regulator. So there's no monitoring of the resource, okay? Because how the balance sheet is constructed, it's not really monitored. It's just accepted by the banking regulator. Now, if we go to the monitoring of the users, the banks, we find that we have very strong collaboration between off-site and on-site supervision of conformance to the banking regulation by the banking regulators, and they really use each other's insights, so they feed off each other. Off-site, by the way, means that documents are sent to the banking regulator. On-site means we go into the bank and we ask the guys, what are you actually doing, okay? In the other 2 countries, what we find is, in one country, there is really a dispersion of these practices where off-site is done by the banking regulator and on-site is done by the auditors and by the central bank, and there's a communication problem. Regulatory arbitrage is not communicated well. And second, the business practices of bankers are not questioned. So in the interviews with the German banking regulator, I was told, look, it's not our problem. They do whatever they do. As long as they're in the realm of the law, it's fine. So it's really a legal form approach. Okay? And in the Netherlands, what we have an equal outsourcing to auditors, which we argue in the paper is a very bad idea. And the second thing is, the way that they evaluated these financial innovations is they basically called up the US and the UK regulators and they asked, well, what do you think about it? Benchmarking. And what happened? Well, these guys were very light touch regulation, so no regulation, regulatory arbitrage is a good thing. Surprise, Netherlands has the same thing. So the monitoring is outsourced entirely to auditors and there are no independent double checks. Now, what happens once there is regulatory capture? So we're going here into the sanctioning part and so on, and into the adaptation part of the rules, as Jan has pointed out, which is very important. In France, you have a negotiation process between the banking regulator and the concerned parties about what needs to be done in order to evolve banking regulation. And the principle is banks have to account for the risks they're taking. And the guy really told me, we never thought of the ABCP market as illegitimate. it's a legitimate market. The only thing that is important is banks have to account for the risk they're taking. Now, in Germany and in the Netherlands, we find a common stance, which is no regulatory burden above global regulation. Global regulation is tough. Our banks have problems. They're not very competitive. They have low profitability. So we will not increase the burden above what Basil says. That was a general maxim. And the second one is, whenever we find in Germany, if they even go to investigate, they still opt for the legal form. So they look at the asset-backed commercial paper market. They say, that looks fishy. They make an investigation and in the end say, no, according to legal form, it's still fine. So we always see this decision tree and then they always go left. And here, what we find important in the Netherlands is really they evaluate the economic substance of this innovation also very much by getting information from the banks. So they asked for input from the banks. Okay. Last but not least, in the accounting regulations, we see a similar thing. The banking regulator is negotiating with the banks and the auditors the new rules. So they set the rules, and they promote accounting standards that close the regulatory loopholes that they have identified. In Germany and the Netherlands, the banking regulator has nothing to do with accounting regulation. So the monitoring of the resource is not done according to the rules set by the banking regulator. It's absolutely absent. It's not there. And that's why we see that there is not really an attempt to force these special purpose entities, these robot companies, back on the balance sheet. See? And now Jan will conclude.
Okay. So what we've tried to explain you is very complex, but basically it comes down to we have something that is very needed for the banking system to survive. And that is the correct representation of risk and then putting equity on the balance sheet that can cover that risk. In 1998, the Basil Accord was agreed upon. That very same year, this thing was invented, while only in 1992, Basil was actually implemented. So it is unavoidable that as soon as you have a rule, they're trying to go about it. Because there's this commons thing. The benefits are private, the problem is shared. Okay. So if we now use our empirical material and we match it with what Ostrom was saying, does that teach us anything about how can we manage this financial commons? Just as a lens, are we doing the right thing? So the first thing was, Ostrom and all her colleagues would say you have to monitor the resource use, and the users. So multiple institutions were involved in all cases to monitor. So it's even talking about this institutional variety. But the problem was that only when these institutions were talking to each other and really communicating that the capturing, the monitoring was actually done. So in Germany, there was a structural separation between the different monitoring units, and they were not communicating, so it was a problem. In addition to that, there were double checks from the different institutions to make sure that they captured what was going wrong. And so as a result of that, the French were very quick at spotting this innovation and doing something about it. So this interactive monitoring and multiple institutions helped to capture it very quickly and to also avoid the escalation of this industry. Because once it's there, it's very hard to pull it back. It's like a balloon that you blow up. It's very hard to take it back to its original shape. So that's the first thing we see. The second thing is principles versus rules-based governance. The German and the Dutch, they were nothing of what you saw was illegal, nothing. But the French used a principles form of regulation. They sat down together with the bankers and the auditors, which was also possible because there were not too many banks, and they were all in Paris, so they could. But they interacted, and they were able to, in a process approach, they were able to capture this and to deliberate. They say, okay, what is the real economic substance? What is the principle, the idea of what you're doing? Rather than in Germany and the Netherlands, what does the rule say? What is the law? And so it's like all Elinor Ostrom would say is, since you sort of take regulatory arbitrage, this innovation, this ducking under the fence of the cow or the pasture, you should take that as a given. The appeal is too big. So you have to take an approach that can accommodate this innovative behavior. And so you have to know the principle of your rules and be able to negotiate over its implementation. The problem with that is, of course, you could get into this all discretionary approach where the power is up to this elite that's going to decide very arbitrarily what's going to happen with this bank. And so there's no rule of law. So this phase of discretion was actually very short. It was always there, but it was also short. So this deliberation phase led to an actual decision on, how do we as a regulator now consider this? But there was still ongoing negotiation over what do we do with this thing? How do we interpret this innovation? And the third thing is, you have a global rule, Basil. It was set in a way that was very coarse, with the best intention to stop this regulatory arbitrage and to save the banking industry from it sawing off the very branch on which it was sitting. So in addition to that, it had a problem of, it was decided in 1998, only implemented in 1992. Same with Basel II and Basel III, which is now in the making, will only be implemented in 2019. So all these rules have long periods that, even though they're there, have this period of, what do we do as a regulator? So we need to evaluate risk locally because of those two reasons. Sometimes global rules are too coarse and evasion is possible for the better or the worse. And so we need to sort of adjust locally what's needed to accommodate that. So to conclude, we believe that we can take an analogy of these commons and overlay it onto the banking system. And it helps us to understand better what happened and why things happened. Second is that this commons literature also provides us lessons how we can govern the thing. And so we should ask ourselves some questions. Are we really monitoring the resource, which is this equity over risk loss? Are we monitoring the users? Do we all understand the rules? Do we evaluate them and enforce them? But do we also allow for changes? Can rules be adopted and changed? Do we have a process perspective to regulation? And is there a variety of institutions from the local to the global and different functional domains that can evaluate that rule circumvention? So, yes, we believe this is useful. And what it also says, our analogy, is that we should take rule circumvention as a given. It's the descriptive fact if we look at it from a commons perspective. And so we need more of a process design. Rather than saying, Basil is now saying this is the rule, we also need to think about how it's implemented and also how it's shifted over time. So instead of taking a static approach in the regulation, take a dynamic approach. And with a focus on the regenerative capacity. And then finally, this notion of the global and the local, taking it also back to the topic of this conference. If we have this global rule, Basil, we cannot allow for discretion locally, otherwise there's no point in having it. But still, let's not forget that regulatory arbitrage is going to happen. So, as a way to remedy global rules where they cause unintended local damage, this rule evasion can sometimes be actually welfare enhancing. And we can go into details about some of these beneficial impacts of the ABCP market. But there are good things that happened in this case. And actually, the French were very deliberative about this. They said, we allow some form of ABCP, and others we're going to tax very heavily. So there was a real evaluation there. But at the same time, we should also, so we're not stopping financial innovation here. But we also have to make sure that we govern the unintended consequences so that we do not have a tragedy of the commons. And so that's where we hopefully have connected all the topics that we discussed. Thank you.
Two questions, not questions, but a comment to link what I heard yesterday and what I heard today. One is about Arijit's point that cows are local, but the grass is becoming global, you know. So how to manage cows locally, whereas since the financial market is today global, how do you maintain the cows, where the discrepancy between maintaining cows in, let's say, emerging market is different than in developed nations. So this is one point which I thought that might be interesting. The second point is, since today the financial market touches all the countries, because it's a global phenomena, interesting comment which I couldn't do on your point is, we heard that the poor of emerging markets are much more dynamic than the poor of developed nations, which is a concept which means that if I have a global arena to discuss, and your last point is how do we keep the dynamism for the global arena in the local markets. So this is my overall comment, and the question is how do you link this, because what you're saying is I have a global rule, but I have to implement it locally. And I have to keep discretion. So when I have to keep discretion, at least for the sake of one country, which we know both Arijit and myself, is when we keep this discretion, there is capital flight, there are many issues which haunts these markets because they are not globally coordinated.
All right, I think that is a very good point, that you made about the cows are local and the grass is global. So I think this is really great. I have a few buts, inevitably. No, but I really want to emphasize that I think for part, my main point basically is that there are two constraints to what you are presenting. But I want to add, before going into the constraints, that if we can do this for a vast sector, it cannot be all. For that part of finance that is pure transactivity, your model does not. It cannot grab it if you want. So if we could do it, I think it would be great, actually. So I think Matthias and you two should really pursue that. Now, the two constraints. So the first constraint is a little constraint. The difference that you point out, which I think is truly interesting, between France and Netherlands, well, France on the one hand. And so the question then about France, and I may be wrong, but I have the impression that the French banking, and it's almost more like, it functions more like a banking sector, even when it is actually into high finance, because it seems more corporate. I think elite formation in France follows a very different model, and that then enables. Now, that means that you actually have to bring in a social formation element in order, you cannot easily move that French model to the United States, for instance. Now, the second constraint, and that is really the bad constraint, and the one that can mess up all good intentions, and that is that so much of finance is pure transactivity. If you take the standard way of measuring the financial market, so to say, outstanding derivatives, we're over $1 quadrillion. So that is a zone, and then throw in hyperfrequency, which is how that, you cannot govern that with this. Now, how you govern that, I mean, I have my own ideas, but this is not the moment to bring them up. But some of those people should go to jail, but that's not, we don't call that regulating, really. But the other part is that the finance should not be allowed to financialize everything. Because the way they do that, they keep financializing interest rates on this and that. So anyhow, but those are, and I don't know if you have any thoughts, and maybe the second one, the hyperfrequency part, just forget about talking about it because it's so extreme. But I'm sort of very curious about this French, whether the French difference is because it is more of a corporate, it's like an elite that works together, and it's not the brutal mechanisms that you see on Wall Street, or the fact that 70% of financial transaction happens in closed networks. We have no grip on that, and they are very exclusionary, because I know a whole bunch of bankers on Wall Street that would like to get into that, and they're not allowed. So when you begin to look at these social formations, at one hand, the French sounds rather reasonable to me, and at the other hand, this sort of, this, yeah.
Yeah, just a short question, and I think Saskia already answered part of it, but I was intrigued by something in your paper when you mentioned that part of the reason the French regulator did such a good job, apparently, was the ties they had with the industry. Common backgrounds, common networks. And I was wondering, on the other side, you hear a lot of critics on revolving doors practices, that kind of things. And I was wondering, during your interviews, or if you got some insights on why it was part of the solution in France and maybe part of the problem somewhere else. So, but
Well, so we already have 3 questions, and let me just add a 4th one, and then you decide how do you deal with all these. So the analogy, so I was wondering, where are the seeds? Because grass will need some seeds, and that really relates to Saskia's idea that finance is a capability, and there is, you come up with these innovations, right? So what does that come from? And also, we are talking about the supply side, right? But what about the demand side, which is even more complex, right? Because people want access to money. So I think the demand side is even huge, with markets opening up in India and China, and how these things travel across borders. So
Yes.
1 minute each. 1 minute each.
Green.
No, Matthias, not you, because 1 minute becomes 10.
Well, so maybe to touch on the commonality between many of your questions, and do answer as well, Matthias, but we discussed, actually, that's the last thing that we discussed yesterday, which is how, so it may look like what we're favoring here is, please, countries across the world, take an example of France. This is how you should be doing. No, our point is more on the theoretical level. So as it seems, the local institutional constructions that were happening in France seemed to do what Ostrom was trying to suggest a local community should be doing to govern its commons. So it might be, well, it's probably very unlikely that the same approach will work in the US or Germany or the Netherlands, for that matter. But as a bank, as a regulator, as an auditor, if you have a sincere interest in trying to maintain that branch on which you're sitting, you might think of these analogies and saying, are we covering all grounds? Otherwise, many of the efforts you are engaging in would be quite pointless. So I would try to take it to the more abstract level and say, what we're trying to give the banking industry is a lens to say, well, when you are deliberating new innovations, wherever they are happening, be it the ones that you mentioned, hyperfrequency trading, or the small communities, and you're trying to figure out, do we allow for that? Is it overeating the grass?
And are you putting back the...
Yes, and or when you are, do you make sure that you have enough equity to cover that?
Thank you. And thank you very much for all your questions. They're great. So the part about discretion, I just wanted to say, so first our argument was, when you have global rules, you need local discretion to deal with the regulatory arbitrage around these global rules. Because temporality, the issue is that Basil makes a rule, the next time you get a rule from Basil is going to be 15 years from now. And that's exactly what happened with the financial crisis. They made a regulatory system. The local systems that didn't adjust get overeating of risk, too much risk taking, and boom, because local discretion wasn't there. Now, to answer the last question of Odier, oui, c'est donc so why is this regulatory interaction not getting something very bad? What we're talking about corruption and so on. Well, one thing is the integrity of the Commission Bancaire, and I think these people usually don't enter into banks, so they're not going to switch. And the second thing is the way that they specifically structured the interactions, because they were talking with the auditors, but also they forced them to talk with them, and they had a whip in the back. So they said, you have to talk with me, and if you don't talk with me, and you have to explain me very well what's going on, and if you don't, out. So they had all the, the sanctions that forced these private guys to talk with them in an honest way. So it's not, we're not advocating talking. We're advocating information exchange based on possible sanctions. That's maybe a way to, and that was very nice in France. That worked very nice in France. Thank you. Thank you. Very